Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Hat Historian. In this video, I'll be talking about a piece of protective headgear that has become synonymous with the daring pilots of old, the aviator helmet. The aviator helmet, sometimes called bomber hat, bomber helmet, or flying helmet, is a close-fitting cap with ear flaps, usually made out of leather, though later canvas or felt ones existed, sometimes lined with fleece or wool, with a chin strap underneath, and a small visor on the front slightly turned up showing the lining. Often paired with goggles, it was designed to protect the wearer from cold, water, fire, and minor scrapes. While supplanted in more recent times by more modern and protective helmets, it still retains an image of daring and adventure, and is still an attribute that conveys the image of an aviator. So let us look at where it came from. There originally wasn't any particular clothing that was specific to the pioneers of aviation. The first to ascend into the sky, in hot air balloons, such as Jean-François Pilâtre du Rosier and François Laurent d'Arlande, who rose up in a balloon made by the Montgolfier brothers, did not go very high, and thus did not need any protection from the elements. They therefore just used their everyday outfits. For all of the 19th century, balloons and airships were the only real form of air travel, and even then, they were mostly experimental, used by scientists and daredevils. The main concern, as hydrogen balloons allowed men to go higher and higher, was warmth, and thus aeronauts would dress in warm coats and hats. However, by the time the 20th century rolled around, new developments allowed for the creation of heavier-than aircraft, culminating with the Wright brothers' historic flight on December 17, 1903, when they made the first controlled, sustained flight with their Wright Flyer. This flight, too, was fairly low to the ground, and the aircraft very simple, so the Wrights wore simple, sturdy street clothing, and their headwear was just their everyday caps, with goggles to protect their eyes. Wilbur would sometimes use one he could pull down over his ears to protect from the wind, and early aviators used a whole variety of headwear, whatever they could find that was practical. The first leather hat, as we picture it, was worn by French aviator Louis Blériot, famous for making the first crossing of the English Channel in an airplane in 1909. Flying higher and in windier conditions than some of his predecessors, he wanted good protection. Furthermore, these early planes had a tendency to spit hot oil and gases behind the engine, roughly where the pilots would be. Thus, Blériot opted to wear a hardy leather skullcap with ear flaps, along with goggles, that would protect him from the cold atmosphere, hot gases, and oil drops, thus cementing the look of the traditional aviator. His fame after his exploit helped cement the look in his colleagues, as much as practical considerations. These early hats were based on motorcycle and auto racing outfits of the early 20th century. Aviation was still in its infancy, and therefore unproven and dangerous, with machines that were little more than prototypes. Landings could often best be described as controlled crashes, and on these wooden and cloth craft, the risk of fire was ever present. These leather helmets, developed to protect motor pilots from similar dangers, were seen as ideal for airplane pilots, with the leather construction protecting from fire and minor abrasions, and they were made fleece-lined to help with colder temperatures at altitude. Some, based on motorcycle helmets, which I have mentioned in my video on the bicycle helmet, were padded or reinforced to protect from shocks. With the establishment of the first military air services, starting with France in 1909, no official gear was at first established, so they continued to use modified motoring equipment. Even with the start of World War I, and the true development of military aviation, flying outfits were disparate, with military-issued flight suits still being variants of leather boots, coats, and hats used by motor racers, usually worn over the official uniform, and most countries allowed pilots to purchase their own privately supplied gear, with many companies starting to manufacture aviation equipment. New planes could routinely reach altitudes of up to 15,000 feet, with temperatures going below -30 degrees Celsius, so heavy protection was needed, and it was found that oiling the leather of the outfits, particularly the helmets, would help retain body heat. Some continued to use reinforced motorcycle-type helmets to aid in survival in case of a crash. Another development that emerged during this time was wireless communication, and so some helmets began to be fitted with earpieces in the ear flaps, in order to hear radio signals, though this was not yet widespread. After the war's end, many pilots were demobilized and returned to civilian life, where they continued to fly privately, and many of them continued to wear the same kind of equipment that they had during the war. Furthermore, flying aces during World War I, even ones from the enemy side, such as the famous Baron Manfred von Richthofen, had achieved a certain celebrity and were regarded as dashing heroes, whose appearance and attitude many new aviators wanted to emulate. Thus, the flying helmet gained new connotations of courage and adventure, a reputation further enhanced by pilots such as Charles Lindbergh or Amelia Earhart. For his 1927 transatlantic flight in the Spirit of St. Louis, even though it had an enclosed cockpit and didn't have the oil leaks of older planes, Lindbergh still wore a leather flight hat, and the image of him wearing it as he exited the plane at Le Bourget impressed an entire generation. Other variants also emerged in the 1920s, with a version resembling a wide pith helmet being developed by the British for use in the Middle East, where the sun could be brutal on pilots sitting in open cockpits. The RAF also designed a new full-dress uniform, which included a leather fur-trimmed hat with a plume as its headgear, that was supposed to be reminiscent of an aviator helmet. However, it did not prove popular with the men, and was soon replaced with a more conventional peaked cap. In the 1930s, the hat continued to have a powerful association with adventurer pilots, as new records were being set. The famous Amelia Earhart wore one on many of her own exploits, even having one that was made in a white color to match her white flight suit. As the decade went on, and the threat of a new war loomed, Air Forces developed new technologies that would be included in the pilot's gear. With enclosed cockpits, the emphasis was no longer so much on warmth, though it did still play a part, but flight helmets were modified to be able to accommodate earphones, a concept that had been experimented with before, but were truly refined. With airplanes flying ever higher, they also began to be made to allow for oxygen masks. During World War II, these types of helmets were used by all sides of the conflicts, often by fighter pilots, though while the pilots of bomber crews tended to wear the crusher caps, the rear gunners, standing in front of open windows, had fleece-lined aviator helmets with sound-protecting earphones to keep warm and be able to hear the communication over the noise of wind and engines. While leather was still very common in that apparel due to its fire resistance, some also began to be made of canvas, which was cheaper. After World War II, the flight helmet began to change. Enclosed, pressurized cockpits of newer planes reduced the need for protection from cold or elements, but new standards of safety and the need for protection during a potential bailout or ejection led to the development of hardened helmets that could protect from a blow. Soon they also started to include built-in visors that could be retracted, that replaced goggles. These mostly were used in fighter planes, nimbler but with a likelier chance of needing to eject, or even a greater risk of hitting one's head on the side of the cockpit during a maneuver. In slower bombers, however, canvas versions were still used in the 50s and 60s to secure radio equipment to the head. While these eventually, too, got replaced by either helmets or by caps depending on the mission, a form of this could arguably be considered to have continued to be used by spacefarers, such as during the Apollo mission, to both secure communication equipment and to keep hair in check during critical mission moments, when pressurized suits tend to be worn. The aviator helmet, in its classic form, has now long since been superseded by more modern, rigid helmets in most military applications, with some new helmets including, beyond communication and breathing equipment, such technology as integrated heads-up displays. In climate-controlled cockpits, warmth is no longer an issue, so they are mostly for protection during maneuvers and in case of needing to eject. In other military aircraft, such as cargo planes, if any hat is worn, it tends to be a visored cap to shield the eyes from the sun. Otherwise, simple headphones are used. There are also sometimes somewhat hybrid versions, made of canvas but with hardened elements on the outside. The classic aviator helmet is considered obsolete in military circles, though it can still be seen in some places, often by private pilots who use open cockpit planes, who still want protection from the wind, the elements, and the integrated radio. These have generally changed little since the 50s, though many are made now of canvas more than leather to be cheaper. Headsets that can arguably be traced back to the flying helmets are also worn by astronauts and cosmonauts during launch and for spacewalks. Beyond its practical use, the aviator helmet still retains a powerful image in popular culture. It is synonymous with the adventurous pilot, and is used in many cartoons or comics to evoke such a character, usually trying to harken back to World War I pilot aesthetics with a scarf, goggles, and a leather jacket. Finally, hats whose design is based on early fleece-lined flight helmets can be commonly found as winter wear, resembling a Ushanka or trapper hat, even going so far as to evoke that origin, such as the Mad Bomber brand. Starting out as a practical piece of headgear adapted for motorsports, used to protect pilots from the cold and elements in the open cockpits of early planes, to a protective helmet that also could hold communication equipment, all the while being a symbol of pilots, the Aviator helmet, while mostly superseded by more modern and protective helmets in the military, endures with private pilots, both for its practical use and to evoke that image of the airmen of old, and it continues to hold a potent place in popular culture. So I hope once again that you found this video interesting and will join me again soon for another hat. Until then, I tip my hat to you.